Hi everyone, today we are going to see about artificial neural networks in machine learning. Neural networks, it is a fundamental concept in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Indeed, it's draw inspiration from structure and function of a human brain. So these are the set of major aspects of a parallel distributed model. First, a set of processing units that is referred as cells. Then, a state of activation for every unit, which is equivalent to the output of unit. So, the next, the connection between the units is defined by weight. Next one is a propagation rule, which determines the effective input of a unit from its external inputs. Then an activation function that determines the new level of activation based on the effective input and current activation. Then an external input for all units. Then a method for information gathering that is referred as learning rule. So why artificial neural network is needed? So actually there are two main reasons. In technical viewpoint, we can say that some problems such as character recognition or the prediction of future states of a system require massively parallel and adaptive processing. Okay, then next, in a biological viewpoint, an artificial neural network can be used to replicate and simulate components of the human brain, thereby giving us insight into natural information processing. So this is a structure of a biological neuron. A typical neuron consists of following four parts. The first one is that dendrites. So they are tree-like branches responsible for receiving the information from other neurons it is connected to. The next thing is that cell body. So actually that soma, S-O-M-A, that represents the cell body of the neuron, and it is responsible for processing of information they have received from the dendrites. Actually, it sums all the incoming signals to generate input. And the next part is axon. It is just like a cable through which neuron can send the information. Then the final one is synapses. It is a connection between the axon and neuron dendrites. The point of interconnection of one neuron with the other neurons. So the amount of signal transmitted depends upon the strength of the connections. See that soma that represents the node, that dendrites that represents the input, and snaps that represents the weight, which means the interconnections between two nodes. And finally that axon that represents the output. So the building blocks of the neural networks that may be called as neurons. So every neuron that receive input from many other neurons. So it changes its internal state based on the present input. Okay, so it can send one output signal to many other neurons. So that we call it as a recurrent network. Actually spikes, it is called as the information that transmitted through a series of electric impulses. So the frequency and the phase that can encode the information. So every neuron it can be connected to as many as 10,000 neurons. So that neuron that receive the information from other neurons in a confined area, that we can call it as receptive field. So this is how ANN works. So this is a connection between a biological neuron and artificial neuron. Here you can see that X0, X1 up to Xn, that represents the input, that W0, W1 to Wn, that represents the weight of the input. So here the processing element, that is represented by that Y0, that is equal to W0 into X0. Similarly for all n inputs, then summation of that value, then an activation function is used that provides the output. So this is how an artificial neuron imitates the human neuron. So these are the main network layers. So the first one is the input layer. This is the first layer of a neural network. So that represents the features or input variables of the problem. So that data is fed into the input layer, and each node typically corresponds to a specific input feature. So the next layer is hidden layer. So they are intermediate layers between the input and output layers. They perform complex transformations on the input data. The number of hidden layers and number of neurons in each layer are design choices and can vary depend on a problem. So the third one is neurons, or otherwise it can be called as nodes. Neurons in a layer process the information. Each neuron that receives input performs a computation and produces a output. Fourth one is weight and bias. So each connection between the neurons has an associate weight that determines the strength of the connection. So the fifth one is activation function that introduce a non-linearity of the network. So the sixth one is output layer. The output layer produces the final result or prediction of the neural network. So this is a example for artificial neuron. So inputs are provided. So each input is assigned with one weight. So they are summation. Then an activation function layer is there. So finally it reaches the output. So this is how an ANN works. First we are setting initial values of the weights randomly. Then read the input. Then process it. Then an output is computed. So compare the obtained output with the expected output, then modify the weights based on that until the condition is met. So we have to go through certain number of iterations. So we have to go through the iteration until we can minimize the error. So these are the types of networks: multiple inputs and a single layer. And the next one is multiple inputs and multiple layers. So this is what we call as a multi-layer perceptron. So here there are two hidden layers, one input layer and output layer. So machine learning by an example, concept of back propagation. So we have to find out the hidden layer transfer function and the output layer transfer function. So first we have to calculate the sigmoid function of that layer and then derivative of that particular layer. Then we have to calculate the linear function. So why gradient is needed? So here you can see that W1, W2 that represents the weight, that O that represents the output of the neuron, and N that represents the net input to the neuron. Okay. So here how the sigmoid function is calculated by using the formula 1 divided by 1 plus exponential of minus n. Okay. So that capital N that represents the net input to the neuron, it is calculated by that O1 into W1, which represents the weight, plus O2 into W2. So the error here is calculated by using the formula actual output minus obtained output. So we have to reduce the error by change the weights. So we have to provide a correct learning rate, then we have to find out the rate of change of error with respect to the rate of change of weight. Here there are two layers are there in between the input and output layer. Now we are calculating the weights, then gradients. So we have to update the weights to minimize the error. Okay. So now you can look at that. So that 0.5 and 0.5 that represents the weight for the initial stage. Now by using that sigmoid function of 1 divided by 1 plus e to the power of minus 0.5, we are calculating the output. Then after obtaining the output, we are calculating the gradient value. So the gradient of the neuron can be calculated with the help of the slope of transfer function product into summation weight of neuron to the next neuron and then multiply them with the output of the neuron. So this is how the gradient of the neuron is calculated. Then you have to calculate the gradient of output neuron. Here the gradient of the output neuron is this G3 and this gradient of the neuron is G1 and G2. So the gradient of the output neuron is calculated by slope of the transfer function into error. So here the error is find as 0.6508. So 1 minus 0.6508 that determines 0.3492, which is the error. A weight update step. So how we are updating the weight? So updating the weight is represented by new weight. So that is equal to old weight plus product of the learning rate gradient prior output. Actually here the old weight that is 0.5, now the learning rate gradient and prior output. So the learning rate is 0.5, gradient is 0.0093 and this prior output is 1. That is calculated in the previous step. Likewise you have to update all the weights. This is the weight update for the step 1. And after updating the weight, we are performing the second pass. So the same procedure is repeating. Now we are getting the error as 0.1967. Now we are getting the error as 0.1967, which means that the output is 0.8033. So 1 minus of this value that defines the error. So our aim is to minimize this error as much as possible. So again we are going for the weight update once again. Okay, so this is the weight update 2. So now repeating the same procedure and updating the weights. Now we are having new weight. This one is called as the third pass. So now we are getting the output as 0.8909. So the error is 1 minus 0.8909. Okay. Now we are putting the weight update summary table. Here you can see that. So this is the initial condition. W1, W2, W3 is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 and the output is 0.6508 and the error is 0.3492. So during the second pass after updating the weight, we are getting slight improvement in W1, W2 and W3. Then we are getting an increase in the output value as 0.8033 and the error becomes less as 0.1967. And again we are updating the weight once again, that is called as pass to update. Here again some improvement in the weight. So we can get the output as 0.8909 and error is minimized to 0.1091. So here the W1 represents the weight from input to input layer, then W2 is input to hidden layer, W3 hidden layer to output layer. So these are some design issues in a neural network. So that initial weights, then transfer function, then root mean square error, that error estimation, then adjusting the weights, then the total number of neurons that is present in a network, then representing the data, whether we are going to represent the data in an image format or signal format or in any data representation, then the training set size. So these are some design issues in a neural network. So how to improve the performance of a neural network is to, first thing is that we have to change the number of layers and number of neurons in each layer. So then some slight variations in the transfer function, then learning rate should be changed, and we have to train for a long amount of time. Then the classifications of pre-processing and post-processing steps. Learning with an multi-layer perceptron concept. So in the intermediate layers, we can't able to get the feedback. So that we have to define a proper error function that is defined by a differentiable function of weights. So we have to calculate the derivatives of the error with respect to the weights in the consecutive layers and use these derivatives to find weight value, then minimize this error function by using a gradient descent algorithm or any other optimization algorithms. So that we call as a back propagation. So how a back propagation is done? So the first thing is gradient descent. Weight is changed in direction of gradient. Then we have to use the chain rule to calculate the weight in the intermediate stages when the data is passed from one layer to another layer. Then dynamic programming, which means that to make the update faster, we have to memorize the weight. So this increases the speed of computation. Then the final one is a very important one, loop over instances. So first one is the forward step. So here we can given out input. So we have to make predictions layer by layer starting from the first layer. So this is called as a forward step. Then next one is the backward step. So we have to calculate the error in the output, then update the weight layer by layer starting from the final one. Then we have to come in a reverse direction. So that one is called as a backward step or back propagation. So let us consider an example. Here in this example, we are having samples, sample 1 and 2, and that input that is represented by I1, I2, then the output target that is represented by T1 and T2 for both the samples. Okay, here you can look at this problem. Here this is I1 and I2 that represent the input, and W1, W3, W2, W4 that represents the weight, corresponding weight, and then H1, H2 that represents the hidden layer, and O1, O2 that represents the output layer. So from the hidden layer, that weight W5, W7, and from H2, W6 and W8 is represented. So that B1, B2, B3, B4 that represents the biasing function, and T1 and T2 that represents the output target. 1 and 2 that represents the samples. So here we have to estimate the optimal values of the weights starting from W1, W2 till W8, then bias values B1, B2. So now in the first step we have to calculate the output of that H1 and H2. That can be, first we have to initialize from the activation function f of x, that is equal to 1 divided by 1 plus e to the power of minus x. So initially we have to calculate the output of H1. Okay, that must be calculated from f of W1 into I1 plus W2 into I2 plus this biasing function. So that 1 divided by 1 plus e to the power of minus 0.3775, that is equal to 0.59327. So similarly output for H2 is calculated W3 into I1 plus W4 into I2 plus B2 into 1. Okay, so these things may be calculated from the diagram that is given. Okay, so from that output H1 and H2 that is calculated, then that output of O1 and O2 is calculated similarly. So now we can find out the sum of squares of the output error, that is given by this 1 by 2 into T1 target value of sample 1 minus output of O1 and plus 1 by 2 T2 minus output of O2, the whole square is a root mean square error. So it is find as 0.298371. So now we have to update the weight based on this. Next step, so we begin from the backward space. So we first adjust the weights leading to the nodes O1 and O2 in the output layer. Then the weights leading to the nodes H1 and H2 in the hidden layer. Then adjust the values of the weights W1 to W8 and bias from B1 to B4. Okay, they are denoted by the plus symbols. Okay, here the learning rate is denoted by eta and the value is given by 0.5. Okay, first we have to compute the adjusted weights leading to O1 and O2. Okay, first we have to calculate the gradient value. So gradient of O1, that is given by T1 minus out of O1 into out of O1 into 1 minus out of O1. Okay, so the gradient of that O1 is calculated first, then the updated weight. We already know the updated weight, that is given by old weight plus product of learning rate, gradient and prior output. Okay, so by this means we updating the weight. Okay, so the old weight, then the learning rate, gradient and output of the prior layer. Okay, so similarly W5 plus, W6 plus and B3 plus are calculated. So this represents the biasing function. So for similarly the gradient for O2 is also calculated. Then from that we can find out the W7 plus, W8 plus, B4 plus, that is calculated. So finally we have to compute the adjusting weights that leading to H1 and H2. So we have to go in a reverse order. So now we are going to calculate the gradient of that H1. So after finding the gradient of the H1, we calculated W1 plus, W2 plus, B1 plus. Okay, which is the updated weights and bias. Similarly, the gradient of H2 is calculated. Then W3 plus, W4 plus, B2 plus is calculated. So now we updated all the weights in this given diagram. Okay, so from the reverse thing we have to calculating. So after finding the gradient of this gradient of O1 and O2, we calculated what are the incoming terms that are coming to the O1, the weights that is calculated. For example, after calculating the gradient of O1, we calculated W5, W7 and B3. So these are the incoming for that O1. So after finding the gradient of this O1, these things updated weights and bias are calculated. Similarly for O2, then H1 and H2, the same thing is repeated from W1 to W8 and updated bias from B1 to B4. We have to repeat these steps until we get the minimized error. And meet in the next video. Till then, goodbye from Vijay. Thank you.